All right, more breaking news to get to. We just learned the victim of a deadly stabbing was an elderly actor with a long list of credits.
We also know the identity of the suspect and his relationship to the victim. The stabbing happened yesterday at a home in Tarzan.
The contractors were just trying to reinforce the cracked concrete foundation under the old ballroom cellar beneath Popeye's James Handy mansion when the drill suddenly dropped into empty space. When they cut the engine, the basement went completely dead silent, except for the low hiss of musty, cold air rushing out of the dark hole. The guys clicked on their flashlights and peered through the gap. What they saw down there in the beam of light completely froze them in their tracks. The midnight call to Blackwood Estate. The call that brought the lead structural engineer out to the Handy estate didn't happen during normal business hours. It came in just after midnight on a rainy Tuesday, and the voice on the other end of the line belonged to the head site manager for the historical restoration project. For the past 6 months, the construction crew had been working on what was supposed to be a straightforward stabilization project. The James Handy Mansion, a sprawling 40-room stone behemoth built on a jagged cliff overlooking the North Atlantic coastline, had been sitting abandoned for nearly 7 decades. The local historical society had finally raised enough capital to turn the property into a public museum, but decades of salt air and brutal winter storms had taken a severe toll on the structure. The immediate priority was the ballroom wing, a massive stone appendage that hung precariously close to the eroding cliff edge. Ground-penetrating radar had shown significant settling beneath the foundation, and the team was tasked with pumping structural grout deep into the earth to stabilize the bedrock. It was tedious, routine work, the kind of job construction crews could do in their sleep. But by midnight, the routine had completely shattered. When the engineer pulled his truck up the winding gravel driveway of the estate, the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the outline of the dark, imposing mansion. The only signs of life were the harsh, flickering beams of heavy halogen work lights pouring out from the ground-level windows of the basement. He grabbed his hard hat and his gear bag, pushing his way through the heavy oak side doors and descending the concrete steps into the subterranean belly of the house. The air downstairs was thick with the smell of damp earth, wet cement, and something else, something sharp and metallic that made the back of his throat itch. He found the entire 5-man crew standing in a tight circle in the far corner of the ballroom cellar, completely silent. Nobody was smoking, nobody was checking their phones, and nobody was packing up their tools, even though their shift had ended an hour ago. The site manager was standing right at the edge of the circle, staring down at a massive, commercial-grade diamond core drill rig that was still bolted to the floor. The heavy steel bit, designed to chew through feet of solid granite, was buried up to its collar in the floorboards. The site manager didn't even say hello when the engineer walked up. He just pointed a trembling finger at the mechanical pressure gauge on the side of the rig. The needle was resting dead at 0. The engineer knew exactly what that meant. When you are drilling into solid foundation or bedrock, the hydraulic pressure stays consistently high as the bit encounters resistance. If the needle drops to 0 instantly, it means the drill has punched through the solid material and entered a complete void. But according to the historical blueprints of the mansion that the engineer had spent weeks studying, there shouldn't have been any void here. The ballroom floor was supposed to be resting on top of a 12-foot-thick block of solid, poured concrete and native fieldstone, specifically engineered to anchor the massive weight of the house to the cliffside. There were no cellars beneath this section, no drainage vaults, and no utility access points. It was supposed to be a solid mass of rock. The lead driller was the one who explained what had happened right before they called. They had been running the bit at a slow, steady pace, expecting to hit the granite shelf about 4 feet down. Instead, at exactly 3.5 feet, the entire 300-pound drilling assembly had suddenly lurched forward, dropping nearly 18 inches in a fraction of a second. It didn't grind to a halt. It just fell, as if the earth beneath the mansion had simply vanished. Fearing a catastrophic sinkhole that could swallow the entire wing of the house, the crew had instantly cut the power to the engine. That was when the sound started. It wasn't a crash or a groan of shifting earth. It was a low, steady hiss, like a massive tire slowly leaking air. The air rushing out of the borehole was freezing cold, and it carried a pungent, suffocating smell of stagnant water, decaying wood, and old grease. The engineer knelt beside the rig, pulling a high-powered tactical flashlight from his utility belt. He dropped to his stomach on the wet concrete floor, pressing his eye as close to the narrow gap between the drill shaft and the edge of the borehole as he could. At first, the beam of his light caught nothing but the swirling white dust created by the drilling process. He waited a few minutes for the air currents to clear the debris. As the dust slowly settled, the beam of light traveled down past the 3 feet of concrete, past the jagged edges of the broken fieldstone, and then it just kept going. It didn't hit dirt, and it didn't hit water. The light cut through a completely open subterranean chamber that stretched out horizontally into the darkness far beyond the boundaries of the ballroom above. As the engineer adjusted the focus of the lens to narrow the beam, the light struck a vertical surface roughly 15 feet below the floor level. It wasn't the rough, uneven face of a natural cavern or a sinkhole. The light reflected off the unmistakable uniform pattern of hand-laid red brick. The bricks were covered in a thick, velvety layer of black mold, but the masonry work was pristine. It was a perfectly constructed arching wall. The engineer shifted the light to the left, following the line of the brickwork. The wall curved up into a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into the shadows beneath the main foundation of the mansion. This wasn't a geological anomaly, and it wasn't a construction defect. The contractors hadn't found a sinkhole. They had accidentally breached the roof of a massive, heavily fortified underground tunnel system that someone had deliberately buried beneath the mansion more than a century ago, a structure completely omitted from every public record, architectural drawing, and historical archive in the city. But who builds a subterranean fortress beneath a coastal paradise? And what were they trying so desperately to hide? The man they called Popeye. To find the answer, local historians had to dig past the architectural records and look into the dark, volatile history of the man who built the estate in 1894. James Handy was not a traditional member of high society. He didn't inherit old money, and he didn't make his fortune in the polite, air-conditioned offices of New York or Boston banking firms. He was a product of the waterfront, a brutal, lawless environment where physical force and absolute control were the only currencies that mattered. Born into poverty near the shipping docks, Handy started his career as a common laborer, loading and unloading cargo ships in the freezing Atlantic waters. He was physically imposing, known for a relentless, unyielding work ethic, and a famously explosive temper that earned him the nickname Popeye among the local dock workers. It was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and respect, and as the decades wore on, that fear became the foundation of his empire. By the late 70s, Handy had leveraged his reputation for intimidation to take control of the local longshoremen's associations. He understood before anyone else that whoever controlled the docks controlled the lifeblood of the city's economy. If a shipping line refused to pay his steep fees, their vessels sat rotting at the piers, their cargo spoiling in the sun because no laborer would dare touch them without Popeye's explicit permission. Within 15 years, Handy had transitioned from a labor boss to an absolute maritime tycoon. He bought out struggling shipping lines, acquired vast swaths of waterfront real estate, and established a monopoly over the region's tugboat and coal bunkering operations. He had amassed a fortune that rivaled the great industrialists of the era, but unlike his peers, Handy never shook the paranoia of the docks. He knew exactly how fortunes were stolen, because he had stolen his own through sheer force, and he lived in constant terror that the very methods he used to climb to the top would be used against him. This profound paranoia reached its peak in the early 90s, a period marked by massive, violent labor strikes across the United States. As workers began to organize and fight back against the brutal conditions imposed by tycoons, Handy saw enemies everywhere. He convinced himself that labor agitators, corporate rivals, and government regulators were conspiring to dismantle his shipping empire. It was during this period of extreme isolation that he commissioned the construction of Blackwood Estate, selecting a remote, jagged cliffside miles away from the city center. On the surface, the mansion was designed to look like a European castle, an opulent display of wealth intended to signal his arrival into the elite class. But beneath the imported marble floors, the hand-carved oak paneling, and the grand crystal chandeliers, Handy was designing a fortress. Historical journals from the few servants who worked at the estate describe a man who grew increasingly reclusive with each passing year. Handy rarely left the perimeter of the property, preferring to manage his vast shipping empire via private telegraph lines routed directly into his study. He deeply distrusted his own domestic staff, firing cooks and maids at the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The mansion became a gilded cage, guarded day and night by a private security force made up of former waterfront enforcers, men who answered only to Handy and were fiercely loyal to his paycheck. Visitors were strictly forbidden, and the local townspeople spoke of the estate in hushed tones, trading rumors about the strange, heavy machinery that was transported to the cliffside under the cover of darkness during the final phases of construction. The townspeople assumed Handy was merely building vaults to store his vast wealth, but the truth was far more complex. He wasn't just building a place to hide his money. He was constructing a hidden infrastructure that would allow him to operate completely outside the boundaries of the law, insulated from the rest of the world. He needed a way to move people, cargo, and information in and out of his estate without ever being seen by his neighbors, his staff, or the authorities who were constantly sniffing around his business dealings. The answer lay not in the aesthetics of the mansion above, but in the engineering of the void below. The architecture of invisibility. Once the engineering team managed to safely enlarge the borehole, they lowered a high-definition robotic camera down into the darkness to survey the structural integrity of the space. What the camera feed broadcast back up to the monitors in the cellar left the crew completely spellbound. This wasn't a standard cellar extension or a crude escape route. It was an engineering marvel of the late 19th century, constructed with a level of precision and structural permanence that rivaled the city's major municipal aqueducts. The tunnel was a massive subterranean artery measuring nearly 12 feet wide and 10 feet high, allowing for multiple people or heavy carts to pass each other with ease. The entire length of the corridor was lined with dense, interlocking red ballast bricks, compressed tightly under the immense weight of the earth above. The vaulted ceiling was engineered with a perfect catenary arch, a design specifically chosen because it evenly distributed the crushing downward pressure of the mansion's stone foundations. As the camera rolled slowly down the center of the passage, the light illuminated a pair of narrow, rusted iron rails embedded directly into the concrete floor. These were industrial tram tracks, identical to the ones used in deep-pit coal mines during the Gilded Age. In standard mansions of the era, wealthy families often built small service tunnels so that servants could transport coal from outdoor storage bins to the basement furnaces without being seen by the family or guests. This was part of what historians call the architecture of invisibility, a design philosophy intended to make the staggering amount of human labor required to run a mansion completely undetectable to the people living upstairs. But the scale of the tracks beneath the Handy estate far exceeded anything required to run a residential heating system. The rails didn't just lead to a furnace room, they stretched out in both directions, forming a subterranean transit network that ran the entire length of the property and vanished into the darkness toward the coast. The construction of this underground network would have required an immense, highly secretive excavation effort. Historical archives from the late 90s reveal no permits, no excavation filings, and no building inspections for any subterranean structures at Blackwood Estate. To pull off a project of this scale without attracting the attention of local authorities or journalists, Handy must have imported his own labor force. Engineering experts analyzing the brickwork believe he likely utilized specialized miners and tunnel diggers brought in from the Pennsylvania coal fields, men who were paid cash, housed entirely within the perimeter of the estate, and sworn to absolute secrecy. The sheer volume of dirt and rock excavated from beneath the house would have been catastrophic to hide, but Handy had a distinct geographical advantage. The mansion sat directly on top of a jagged ocean cliff, allowing his crews to dump thousands of tons of excavated stone directly into the volatile Atlantic surf below, where the crashing waves instantly washed the evidence away. As the robotic camera pushed deeper into the western leg of the tunnel, the structural details became increasingly defensive. The walls, which began as standard brick, transitioned into thick, reinforced concrete sections stamped with industrial-grade markers from 1895. The air in this section grew noticeably colder and damp, thick with the heavy scent of salt and low-tide brine. The camera passed beneath specialized acoustic baffles, curved, acoustic panels built into the brick ceilings. These baffles were designed to absorb sound waves, ensuring that even if heavy, iron-wheeled cargo carts were being pushed violently down the tracks at 2 o'clock in the morning, not a single vibration or rumble would telegraph upward through the floorboards of the grand ballroom or the dining hall above. Handy had engineered a space where an entire industrial operation could take place right beneath his family's feet, completely silent and completely invisible to the outside world. But as the preservation team tracked the path of the iron rails, they noticed strange anomalies that didn't align with standard servant architecture. The tunnel wasn't just connecting the house to a coal bunker or a kitchen pantry. Every 50 feet, the camera passed heavy, reinforced iron rings bolted directly into the brick walls, positioned at shoulder height. The floor beneath these rings showed heavy, localized wear, as if something or someone had been tethered to them for extended periods. The further the tunnel traveled away from the house and toward the shoreline, the more the space began to resemble a subterranean prison or a highly secure bunker rather than a utility corridor. The pristine, invisible luxury of the mansion above was entirely dependent on the dark, heavily fortified secrecy of the labyrinth below. Yet, as the surveyors pushed past the service tracks and into the deepest recesses of the bedrock, they realized this tunnel wasn't built for servants at all. The unthinkable relic. The robotic camera eventually reached a dead end, or what appeared to be one. A massive, solid iron door blocked the passage, completely sealed by a heavy mechanical locking mechanism that had rusted shut over the last century. Rather than risking damage to the structural integrity of the tunnel roof by blasting through the iron, the restoration team used a specialized plasma cutter to carefully carve a precise viewport through the center of the door. When the engineer pushed a fiber optic scope through the newly cut opening, the artificial light illuminated a hidden chamber that changed the entire nature of the discovery. This wasn't a storage vault or a drainage tank, it was a subterranean control center, a hidden bunker carved directly into the living granite shelf beneath the cliffside. Sitting right in the center of the damp stone room was the object that completely froze the team in their tracks. A heavy, industrial-grade iron chair bolted directly to the bedrock floor, outfitted with thick, fossilized leather straps on the armrests and leg restraints. The leather had cracked and darkened from a century of moisture, but the heavy brass buckles were perfectly intact. Directly across from the chair stood a rusted iron workstation, its surface still covered in early maritime telegraph equipment, wet battery jars, and stacks of heavily decayed ledger books that had dissolved into a gelatinous mush over the decades. This room was a completely isolated, soundproofed chamber, buried 40 feet beneath the earth, designed for absolute confinement and interrogation. As the scope scanned the perimeter of the bunker, the structural details revealed a dark, highly functional design. The room was equipped with its own dedicated ventilation shaft that bypassed the main house entirely, venting straight out through a hidden crevice in the ocean cliffside to prevent any sounds, screams, or smells from rising into the living quarters above. In the far corner of the room, a heavy steel hatch was set into the floor. The engineer noted that this hatch opened downward into a vertical shaft that dropped directly into the sea caves beneath the mansion. A water gate that allowed boats to enter the subterranean complex directly from the ocean at high tide, completely bypassing the public docks and the eyes of anyone watching the coastline. The walls of this hidden chamber were lined with vertical iron bars, partitioning the space into 3 individual, narrow holding cells. Inside the cells, the floor was slightly sloped toward a central drainage grate, a chillingly pragmatic design feature intended to allow the space to be easily hosed down. The presence of this fortified holding facility beneath a private residential estate provided undeniable physical evidence of the lengths to which James Handy went to protect his empire. This wasn't just a passive hiding place, it was an active, offensive infrastructure built to detain, question, and silence individuals outside the jurisdiction of any legal authority. The engineering of the room suggested it was built during the absolute height of the shipping wars of the late 90s. The walls were reinforced with double-layered brickwork and lined with sheets of lead, an early form of acoustic dampening that ensured whatever occurred inside the vault stayed entirely within the vault. The discovery of the restraint chair and the holding cells completely recontextualized the entire estate, turning what was thought to be a simple historic mansion into a monument of corporate ruthlessness and absolute unchecked power. To decipher the true purpose of these hidden cells and the chair in the dark, historians had to look away from the architecture and turn their attention toward the violent, forgotten history of the waterfront. The shadow economy of the waterfront. During the closing years of the 19th century, the North Atlantic shipping industry was less of a regulated business and more of a low-intensity war zone. The public docks were completely controlled by a complex network of private enforcers, corporate police forces, and corrupt local politicians who looked the other way in exchange for a percentage of the maritime profits. For an industrialist like James Handy, maintaining absolute control over this chaotic environment required more than just financial influence. It required a shadow infrastructure that could operate entirely outside the view of the legal system. The waterfront was plagued by intense labor strikes, union organization efforts, and aggressive corporate espionage from rival shipping firms looking to break Handy's monopoly on the trade routes. To combat these threats, Handy established a highly sophisticated intelligence and security operation that relied heavily on the hidden geography of his estate. The secret Watergate hatch discovered inside the tunnel provided a direct, unmonitored pipeline from the open ocean into the heart of the mansion's basement. Under the cover of night, private tugboats and small, unflagged wooden launches could slip into the sea caves beneath the cliffs, discharging sensitive cargo, private correspondence, or captured individuals directly into the subterranean network. Because the Watergate bypassed all customs houses, port authorities, and public watchmen, Handy could move anything and anyone in and out of the region without leaving a single paper trail. Historical court records from the late 90s contain numerous accounts of union organizers, strike leaders, and rival informants who mysteriously vanished from the waterfront docks, only to reappear weeks later halfway across the country, completely broken and refusing to speak about where they had been held. Local police forces, heavily funded by Handy's corporate donations, consistently blamed these disappearances on random waterfront violence or transient workers moving on to other cities. The discovery of the fortified holding cells and the heavy restraint chair beneath the ballroom floor provides the missing physical link to these historical anomalies. The bunker wasn't designed for storage. It was an off-the-books detention facility where Handy's private enforcers could interrogate informants, suppress labor uprisings, and extract critical intelligence from corporate rivals in absolute secrecy. The ledger books found dissolving on the iron table, though mostly ruined by a century of dampness, contained faint fragments of ink that historical preservationists were able to analyze using specialized multispectral imaging. The legible portions revealed lists of names, dates, and corresponding monetary figures next to terms like security retention and dockside clearing operations. These fragments suggest the tunnel system served as the central hub for a massive, unrecorded shadow economy. It was a clearinghouse for illicit maritime activities, ranging from the smuggling of untaxed luxury goods to the covert financing of private anti-union militias. Handy used his wealth to build a parallel legal system beneath his feet, one where he acted as investigator, judge, and jailer. This subterranean operation allowed Handy to insulate his public persona from the brutal realities of his business practices. While he sat upstairs in his grand dining hall, entertaining city officials, foreign investors, and the cultural elite of the region, his enforcers were working directly beneath the floorboards, ensuring that the wheels of his empire kept turning through sheer intimidation. The architecture of the mansion was deliberately designed to maintain this psychological separation. The thick concrete foundations and the elaborate acoustic baffles didn't just hide the noise of the tunnels from the outside world, they hid the noise from Handy's own family, creating a literal barrier between the polite society of the Gilded Age and the violent labor exploitation that funded it. As the shipping industry slowly transitioned into the 20th century and federal regulations began to tighten around the waterfront, these private shadow operations became increasingly difficult to maintain. The introduction of federal investigators and stricter maritime oversight meant that maintaining an active, illegal underground bunker carried a massive risk of exposure. Rather than risking federal prosecution, the aging tycoon chose to phase out the underground operations during the final years of his life. The Watergate was permanently sealed with heavy timber bulkheads, the telegraph lines were cut, and the entry points from the main house were meticulously bricked over and covered with fresh concrete, burying the dark history of the waterfront empire directly beneath the foundation of the house. In the end, the stones under the estate tell a story that the official history books tried to smooth over for more than a century. The map of a forgotten divide. The stone corridors stretching out into the dark beneath Blackwood Estate do more than just connect old basement walls. They serve as a raw, physical map of a time when industrial power was absolute and completely unchecked. For over a century, the history of the Gilded Age has been presented through the lens of preservation, as a story of beautiful architecture, grand ballrooms, and the incredible wealth of the families who built America's early industries. But the discovery of the tunnel beneath the James Handy Mansion forces a much more complicated reality into the light. It proves that the luxury enjoyed by the elite of that era wasn't just separate from the harsh world of the working class. It was built directly on top of it, relying on heavy brick vaults and soundproofed chambers to keep the two worlds completely isolated from one another. When the preservation teams finished mapping the full layout of the subterranean network, they realized the true scale of the operation Handy had run from his cliffside fortress. The tunnel network wasn't a temporary patch or a hasty afterthought. It was a permanent, heavily funded monument to corporate paranoia and control. By sealing the Watergate, burying the tram tracks, and walling off the interrogation room, Handy had managed to protect his public legacy for generations, leaving behind the image of a successful, self-made maritime pioneer. The historical narrative had been successfully smoothed over, hiding the violent clashes, the missing waterfront workers, and the illegal shadow economy that actually kept his shipping empire afloat. As modern historians and structural engineers continue to clean out the silt and stabilize the crumbling brick arches beneath the ballroom, the space is no longer viewed as a simple utility cellar. It stands as an undeniable piece of physical evidence regarding the lengths to which early industrialists would go to bypass the law and protect their fortunes from the very people who built them. The real mystery of the Handy Mansion isn't a supernatural ghost story or a fictional urban legend. It is the tangible story of a massive social and physical divide, a reminder that beneath the grandest monuments of wealth and progress, there is often a hidden, silent foundation built entirely on secrecy, force, and absolute isolation. The tunnels under Blackwood ensure that this darker, more honest side of history can finally no longer be ignored. The truth beneath the Handy Mansion proves that power always leaves a footprint, even when buried in stone. History belongs to those who dig past the surface. If you want to uncover more forgotten secrets and dark architectural mysteries, hit subscribe and join us in the next upload. Thanks for watching.